It seems like a while since I've been up here. We were on vacation for a week, and Karen finally got to scratch something off her bucket list. She got down to Muir Woods. We got down to Muir Woods, and she had the opportunity to hug a redwood. You really need to friend Karen on Facebook, because that's where all the pictures are posted. You see the picture of her hugging this giant redwood with her red gloves on that she had to buy because we didn't realize how cold and damp it got down there in the valley of Muir Woods. But it was a really nice time, and it's great to be back. Because the last time I was here, we were talking about the places that scare us. And we were working with a story from the Gospel of Mark where Jesus and his 12 students are crossing the Sea of Galilee, and they get into some trouble. They get caught in a storm. And it's so bad that water's coming over the sides of the boat, and the boat's getting ready to sink because they can't get rid of the water in the boat because Judas forgot to bring the buckets. Now, I made that part up about Judas forgetting the buckets, but we know it was a bad situation. And you got the disciples in this state of panic. They're essentially running around in circles on this boat, not knowing what to do. And in the meantime, remember where Jesus was? Sound asleep, right? Sound asleep in the back of the boat. All around him is turmoil. And he's in a state of consciousness that's so peaceful that he could sleep. Just another storm, you know. No big deal. He knew his students were professional sailors. He trusted that they'd be able to get through this. They knew what to do, supposedly. The problem was the disciples hadn't gotten the memo yet. They didn't believe in themselves. So what did they do? They woke Jesus up so that he could take charge of the situation, and he did it by saying 3 little words: peace, be still. A lot of people think he was talking to the storm. And if you take the story literally, that appears to be true. However, do we look at the Bible that way in Unity? No, we do not. We do not interpret the Bible literally in Unity. We interpret these stories metaphysically or symbolically. We look at the symbolism and we look at what the story can tell us about the evolution of human consciousness and the state of our own spiritual growth right here and now. That's what these stories can still do for us. It's not a story about a storm that happened over 2,000 years ago. This is about the storms that can rage in our own consciousness today. What are some of the things that we feel threatened by in the world? Is it a long list? It's a pretty good sized list of the things that we hear about that cause those storms of worry and fear and anxiety to crop up in our minds. Stories of storms and floods and terrorism and economic recessions and the threat of illness and things like that. No shortage of things that can make us feel and react like the disciples were feeling and reacting in that boat that day. Helpless, alone, abandoned. Remember the part where they thought that Jesus didn't care about them. They said, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Oh, woe is me. Where is the Christ when we need him?" Same place as always, right? He's not going anyplace. The Christ in our midst, our own consciousness. They couldn't see it. It's the height of error thinking to believe that the Christ sleeps or abandons us or is unavailable. But that's exactly what the disciples are doing. They're indulging in some major error thought. And we do the same thing too, don't we? And it's not because we're weak or because we're bad people. I mean, enough of the negative self-talk, okay? Let's not go there. The reason we think that Christ sleeps or abandons us is because we don't know any better, or we forget. It's a perfectly human thing to do. There's something in our human culture, there's something in our collective consciousness that seems to steer us away from our own indwelling power. Something in us that doesn't want to claim that birthright. There's something in us, in our culture, that seems to support us in that kind of error thinking. I want to refer again to a wonderful old book called Lessons in Truth by Emily Cady. It comes to us from the 1890s, and it still has insights that work for us today. Here's what she says. She says, "With a restlessness that is pitiful to see, people are ever shifting from one thing to another, always hoping to find rest and satisfaction in some anticipated accomplishment or possession. Men fancy," I just love the way she writes, people don't write like that anymore. "Men fancy that they want houses and lands, great learning or power. They pursue these things and gain them only to find themselves still restless, still unsatisfied." At the great heart of humanity, there is a deep and awful homesickness that never has been and never can be satisfied with anything less than a clear, vivid consciousness of the indwelling presence of God. And in Unity, we have a name that we use for that consciousness of the indwelling presence of God. We call it the Christ. And it isn't just some thing that dwells in us, it is us. It is who we are. So if that's true, how could we possibly miss it, or forget about it, or think that it's asleep? Here's some more from Lessons in Truth. She says, "Oh, the awfully paralyzing effect of fear and evil. It makes us helpless as babes. It makes us small, whereas we might be giants, were we only free from it. It is at the root of all our failures, of nearly all sickness, poverty, and distress. But we have the promise of deliverance from even the fear and evil when we are in the secret place." Okay, now that might sound a little woo-woo, the secret place, that kind of thing. But it's really very simple. What she means by the secret place is that simply that it is a personal journey. She calls it the secret place. She says it is a secret place because it is a place of meeting between the Christ at the center of your being and your consciousness. A hidden place into which no outside person can either induct you or enter himself. So, no one can pick us up and take us there. No one can give it to us, or inject it into us, or project it into us, or transmit it into us. No one can give it to us or sell it to us for that matter, but don't we like to go thrashing around sometimes? Huh? Don't we like to go thrashing around chasing the latest and greatest guru or the next best self-help book, that kind of thing, looking for an easy fix? Now later on, our co-founder Charles Fillmore came along, and he came up with his own way of describing the secret place. He calls it the silence. You've probably heard that term before, the silence. It's the secret place. The silence is that clear, vivid consciousness of the indwelling presence of God, direct insight into the truth of our being, the Christ that calms the storms of fear and error thought. The silence is probably one of the most important things that we teach in Unity. In his book, Talks on Truth, Charles Fillmore says that all power has its birth in the silence. All power has its birth in the silence. There is no exception to this rule in all the evidence of life. Noise is the dying vibration of a spent force. So in our gospel story, the power of the Christ to confront the situation and say the words, "Peace, be still," had its birth in the silence. That's what the story means. If we're not following the example and practicing the silence during the calm times, we're going to wind up like the other guys on that boat, running around in circles, not knowing what to do. They're saying to Jesus, "Hey, don't just sit there. Do something." The Christ says, "Don't just do something. Sit there." Sit there in the silence. All power has its birth in the silence. The man, Jesus, he learned something to do. He learned how to do something that his students were still learning. When Jesus was faced with a challenge, we see time and time again in the Bible where he goes off by himself, up onto the mountain, off into the wilderness, to take some time to be alone, to practice the silence. But we never hear about the disciples doing that, do we? The one time where Jesus asked them to join him in the silence was outside the Garden of Gethsemane. Remember that story? He said, "Come and sit with me in the silence." What happens? They all fall asleep. They all fall asleep because they didn't have the benefit of the kind of practice that Jesus did. They were beginners. It's going to happen. So, when they're out on the boat, they're still asleep. But this time they're sleepwalking. And Jesus, the guy who appears to be asleep, is actually in the silence. He's the only one who's in control of the situation. Isn't that interesting? The guys who are awake, running around in circles, they're sound asleep. Jesus, who appears to be sound asleep, he's in charge of the situation. And by the way, don't use the silence as an excuse for sneaking a nap when you're supposed to be awake. You know the old excuse, "Oh, I wasn't sleeping, I was just resting my eyes." Using the silence as an excuse to take a nap, I would imagine there's some serious karmic consequences for that. You know? It's like the guy at work who gets caught sleeping at his desk. The boss walks in and he says, "I was just meditating on our mission statement and envisioning a new paradigm." Karma will come back and bite you someplace for that. But you know, karma really is just the same as cause and effect, right? We practice the silence on our own time when things are calm. Practice is the way we set the cause in motion, and the effects are both immediate and far-reaching. Remember, at the level of consciousness, cause and effect are not separated by time. At the level of consciousness. When we practice the silence, we are not bringing something into being that wasn't there before, that is separated by time. We're remembering something that's been there all along that we tend to forget. When we practice the silence, even for just a couple of minutes, we're having an encounter with our true self, our divine or our Christ nature. So we can start the process, and you can do this just about any time. I don't recommend it when you're behind the wheel, but when you're sitting, waiting, standing in line sometime, you can start by simply reminding yourself that there is only one presence and one power that expresses as matter, energy, life, consciousness. It's a good idea to give ourselves a reminder of that from time to time, as often as we can. Paul Hasselbeck, who is the Dean of Spiritual Education and Enrichment back at Unity Village, he's also the author of a book called Heart-Centered Metaphysics. He tells us that the first discipline of mind, when we want to practice the silence, is to establish the knowledge, the certainty that there is only one presence and one power. Paul suggests that we do that by making a bold statement, like maybe saying, "I am divine mind." A lot of us kind of recoil at that, right? How many of us kind of stop and say, "Oh my gosh, that's too much for me to claim"? That's a bold statement. We have to be bold because sometimes we need to kind of shock ourselves out of the complacency that says, oh no, that ain't me. We need to shock ourselves out of complacency so we can focus our attention on the truth of our being. And then, once we're focused, and we start to become aware of the storms and the chaos of thoughts sloshing around like water coming over the side of a boat, we can try using that little 3-word phrase that Jesus used to help keep our attention from being led astray and distracted. We say, peace, be still. Focus with a bold statement, and when we feel distracted, we anchor with peace, be still. We use it as an anchor when things become distracting. If we keep working this persistently and gently, ultimately distractions will fade away. Eventually, we find ourselves in a state of consciousness where there's no longer this separation between subject and object. There's no distinction between me as the witness and that which is being witnessed. There's no I that is aware. There is just awareness. There's no longer two or more. There's just one. It's a state of illumination. Peace. Be still. It leads to the silence. That's that state of illumination. It's an experience. There's still going to be sounds. Still going to be sensations. Doesn't mean we turn into a zombie or that we cease to be aware, but it's a special kind of awareness. Something else to remember, we're not looking for a message. We're not looking for an experience or a vision or a demonstration in the silence. That's not what it's about. The ego, the personality, tells us this is boring. The silence is boring. And then it starts looking for something flashy and entertaining, and before we know it, we're just daydreaming. The silence is a state of pure knowing and pure being. The idea is to simply experience the metaphysical reality that there is something eternal and unchanging. Think of it as laying the foundation for what has to come later, because eventually we are going to have to leave the silence and go back into the world just like Jesus had to get up off the cushion in the back of the boat. We engage the world again. But when we've done our work in the silence, things start to look different. We start to experience all of those different people and different experiences and things out there as just this one thing. Spirit, divine mind, Buddha nature. That's the practical application. That's why we don't go looking for a demonstration in the silence. The greatest benefit of practicing the silence is to awaken our understanding of truth. That's what gives rise to action, but it's a very important kind of action. It's not the running around in circles kind of action. It's decisive, clear, authentic action. It's action that's based on an experience of truth, and it's an action that arises from clarity. There's a huge difference. The world of appearances, still there. I don't become you. You don't become me. It's just that the world of appearances becomes less of a problem. Maybe even no problem. That's what can happen when we use the silence to learn how to say, peace, be still, in the face of something that in our past history has had the tendency to overwhelm us. So, put this in your spiritual toolbox. Pull it out and practice with it as much as you can. Because as much as we like to stay focused on the positive, we know that there are going to be a few storms in our lives that we have to deal with. And the best way to be ready for it is to practice when things are calm. See you next time.